Well, welcome back. Welcome back after the tea break. Hello, online audience. We're back in session now here at the ANU. And welcome to our session now on regional dimensions of the energy transition, as well as green industry opportunities and green industry policy. So that's really two topics that we're wrapping into one. But you will see, if you don't already know, there's plenty and plenty of connections between those two topics: regional and social transition and green industry development. As before, we've got a tremendous list of speakers here covering government agencies, industry, civil society organizations, as well as ANU-based experts. And so our list of speakers, it's in the program. We've changed the order just very slightly. It's firstly Travis Bover, who's First Assistant Secretary with the Net Zero Economy Authority, I think we call it now, that this is through Parliament more or less. Maybe a few days to go until the migration from agency to authority happens. We have online, I hope, Amanda Cahill, Dr. Cahill, who's the CEO of the Next Economy civil society organization and think tank. We have with us here Sarah Boddington, who's working towards her PhD here at ANU Crawford Public Policy School. We have Margie Johnson, who's the CEO of the Australian Aluminium Council, and we have Dr. Joe Coventry, Associate Professor at the ANU School of Engineering. And as before, we will have brief introductory talks, and then we will sit down for an extended chat, first within the panel, and then with you all in the room and online. And with that, Travis, the floor is yours. Travis Bover of the Net Zero Economy Authority.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks to the ANU for the opportunity to be involved today, and thanks to all of you for tuning in, being here in person or online. So as Frank mentioned, I'm from the Net Zero Economy Agency, soon to be authority. So it's a new government body. In fact, legislation to create it was passed through the Parliament just last week, I think it was. And it'll take effect soon, and it's at that point that we become an authority rather than an agency. So given we're new, I thought I'd just take the opportunity to introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about what our role is, where we're working and what we're doing. So our role is focused on managing the economic transition associated with the global shift to net zero emissions. This distinguishes us a bit from other government bodies that are focused on things like achieving emissions reductions, developing green industries, energy system change, and so forth. We obviously intersect and relate with their work, but our objective is a bit different. It's to support orderly economic change as industries decarbonise and new green industries develop. Or to put differently, and to use terms that are probably more often used in academic and international circles, our job is to support a just transition as the world decarbonises. So why is this needed? Well, global decarbonisation is driving significant economic change. We've heard that in the earlier session. It's a source of opportunities, but it's also a source of exposure to impacts, especially for Australia's emissions-intensive industries, workers and regions. If we manage those things well, we can leverage the opportunities and we can create good jobs, strong regional economies and thriving communities into the future. Conversely, if we don't manage it well, we risk leaving some people behind and some communities behind as the world changes around them. So our job is to help ensure that change is managed well instead of poorly. So where are we working? The legislation establishing the authority says that we should prioritise regions, workers and communities that will be most significantly affected by the transition to a net zero economy. We know that many emissions intensive jobs and communities and industries are concentrated in particular regions, and that they're central to the identity of the region and to their economy and their way of life. The Gladstone Central Queensland region, for example, has over 10% of its workforce employed in carbon intensive industries, including 4 coal-fired power generators, significant mining and manufacturing industry, 21 safeguard facilities accounting for 14% of national safeguard emissions in Australia. But we also know that the same region has a lot of opportunities in a net zero economy. It can be a hub for green industries such as green alumina, aluminium, cement, and ammonia. So while there's exposure to change as the world decarbonises, if we manage it well, the region and its people can also thrive in a net zero world by transitioning to the opportunities that a net zero economy presents. Similar story can be found in several other regions around Australia. There's exposure to change, but there's also strong opportunities to net zero. So based on those sorts of considerations, we're currently focusing our attention on the regions shown on the slides. These aren't the only regions or only issues that we'll work on, but they are our focus in this early stage of our life. So what are we doing? The legislation establishing the authority gives us a diverse range of functions, including facilitating investment in new and decarbonised industries that provide jobs and economic opportunities in a net zero world, helping workers in emissions intensive industries move into new opportunities through things like retraining supports and in some cases facilitating redeployment between facilities. We'll also have a specific role around supporting First Nations people to participate in and benefit from the net zero transition. And we have a role in helping to build community understanding and engagement with the net zero transition and what it means for them and their community. We're working to deliver these functions in a place-based way. For us, that means working with each region to understand what their aspirations are and their strategy for navigating the transition to a net zero world. What does it mean for them? What are the issues that they need to work through and confront? Many of the regions that we're focusing on have already developed such plans, and the next speaker, Amanda, may well touch on that. Having understood the regions, our job is then to identify and deliver the value-adding contributions that we can make, but it's not just for us. We want to do that in coordination with state governments, local governments, private sector, and so forth. So in the Hunter Valley, for example, what we're working towards is developing a regional workforce transition plan in consultation with people in the region that provides tailored supports for workers, their families and their communities to prepare for the changes to the types of jobs that are going to be available in that region over a long period of time as that region decarbonises. As power stations like Eraring approach closures, we also have a specific role in administering what's called the Energy Industry Jobs Plan, which is a way of ensuring that workers in closing power stations and dependent employers, get appropriate supports to retrain and move to new opportunities. And we can also facilitate redeployment to other employers. Also in the Hunter, we'll work with the New South Wales Government and others to identify what are the opportunities and needs to help decarbonise existing industries and develop new decarbonised industries so that there are jobs and opportunities, economic opportunities for people in that region into the future. In the other regions that we're focusing on, the story is very much the same, but it's also different because the approach we're taking is tailored to what each region needs, what the risks are that they're facing, what their aspirations are, and so forth. We're still at a very early stage, as I mentioned. We're not even formally established yet, and we have a lot of learning to do as we go, and we'll adapt our approach as we go. So we'll have a strong focus on monitoring, evaluation, and learning as we go. And one of the other things we'll do is, while our role is supported on working with regions and people in those regions to help them through the change, we can also get a lot of insights from that work, and we'll feed those insights and that information into government so that government policy over time is as responsive as it can be to that objective of a just transition as the world decarbonises. So that's a brief overview of our authority. Hopefully it was helpful. I'll draw a line under it there and pass to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Travis. Plenty to come back to there in conversation. And just to point out that actually the creation of novel types of institutions has traditionally been one of the things that Australia has been quite successful with internationally, globally. And so I think all eyes will be on the Net Zero Economy Authority in years to come, not only in Australia, but internationally. Our next speaker joins us online, Dr. Amanda Cahill, CEO of The Next Economy. I think Amanda plans to share with us her group's research on what types of regional communities will be most impacted or affected or interacting with, I should say, energy transition.
Okay.
And here we go.
Can
Amanda, over to you. We
see
can
and
hear
hear?
you loud and clear.
Oh, great. Hi, everyone. I'm really sorry I can't be there today. I picked up a particularly nasty bout of COVID when I was in Canberra last week, so it's all Canberra's fault. So I couldn't come back this week to be with you today. As Frank mentioned, I'm the CEO of The Next Economy, and we support regions to transition to a climate resilient, regenerative and fair economy. So our main question that we work on is, what does good economic development look like as we decarbonise? So good economic development in terms of making sure everyone benefits from this, and that we're also protecting and using this as an opportunity to protect and regenerate the environment as well. We're most well known for our work in Gladstone with the council. They're coming up with a 10-year economic transition roadmap, which was actually, what most people don't know, was the culmination of over 6 years work in building relationships and understanding across the region around what changes were already happening and how they could manage that. We've done similar planning efforts in the Hunter and Latrobe Valley, supporting other groups with that. And we're currently working in Mount Isa now around the role it could play in helping the world to decarbonise, given their critical minerals supply, but also processing capacity. We're also working in Western New South Wales around the Hay region, looking at sort of the triple challenge of decarbonising agriculture while we're getting new energy developments and climate impacts all at the same time. So our job is to help regions navigate these very complex challenges that we've been talking about today. And it's very complementary to the work of the Net Zero Economy Authority, which I'm so happy is finally up. And congratulations, Travis, and the team who've been working really hard on that for quite a long time. So in the work that we're doing, I guess I wanted to break this down a bit into some of the practical challenges we're seeing on the ground. And they're different, there's kind of 3 different regions here that are at the centre of the green industrial revolution that we're in at the moment. The first region, which Travis talked about, is sort of the industrial regions that are also facing the closure of coal plants over the next 5 to 10 years. So places like Hunter, Latrobe Valley, Central Queensland, Collie. Overall, they've actually had quite a lot of support and attention to date. So, for example, Latrobe Valley Authority has been really important in supporting the region. And there's a lot of government support looking at how they're going to support coal workers, but also making sure investment flows to industry in those areas. There are also regions where there's been quite a lot of civil society work that's been done, and often quite in an invisible way, like groups like the Hunter Jobs Alliance leading community conversations and doing that organising. And we're seeing those efforts really pay off now. There's a clarity in the story they're telling about the opportunities for their region. We're seeing local leaders with the confidence to talk about what they want to see in terms of development. They're getting investor interests. And, you know, for example, in Gladstone, when Dutton came out with his nuclear plan recently, the Gladstone Council was one of the first cabs off the rank in the media saying, thanks, but no thanks, we have our plan and it's a renewable energy future and we're getting on with it. So that's the first region. The second region, I guess I wanted to highlight here in this conversation is our regions that haven't been getting as much attention and support. They're also green industrial hubs, but not so linked to coal. And they have what the world needs to decarbonise in terms of the critical minerals, but also the processing, metals processing capacity that a few people have talked about today. So Upper Spencer Gulf, Pilbara, Mount Isa, places like that. They haven't been getting as much attention. And I think there's a bit of an assumption that, you know, they're industrial centres, we've done industrial development before, we get the investment settings right and they'll be right. But actually we're hearing the opposite. We're getting a lot of phone calls from people quite concerned that there's a lot of hesitancy amongst investors in not getting the support they need. They don't have the infrastructure in place. They're worried about impacts on things like water, or environmental pollution around new different kinds of mining that they don't really understand yet. We're getting First Nations groups worried about new developments and what does that mean for them into the future. And one of the biggest challenges that I want to raise here that it hasn't come up yet is also that we're working in areas where there's a lot of power with the incumbent mining companies. And that has been starting to get in the way of new players entering the economic development scene. We saw last week that the GFG Alliance actually sacked, there were 116 jobs announced, losses announced, and that's after 56 earlier. And that there's some holdups around investment that could actually expand the economic opportunities in that region. Similarly, Mount Isa, where Glencore, is in the driver's seat around not just the copper reserves, but it actually has quite a lot of control over the energy and water systems, the processing facilities, the freight and the transport facilities. So where you've got that concentration of power around companies, there's questions about how other people can invest and get involved in that economic development. And the third region that has very different set of challenges are areas in res zones that are identified more as agriculturally in the past, where we're seeing new renewable energy come in. They don't see themselves as energy producers or part of the green industries. And there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation, and council's feeling very underprepared to deal with the scale of development that's coming in and having to negotiate with different players. And we've got a project that we're just starting in New England around a different way of supporting communities to manage all of that. But I'm not going to talk about that because Sarah's going to talk about that a little bit more, those communities and what they're facing. So there's just a few things I want to highlight. Even though they're different contexts, we're seeing some patterns around the kinds of support that would enable a smoother transition across those three different contexts. And the first, which has been touched on by a number of speakers already, is that it's not just about industry and workers. We've got to invest in the foundations that enable or underpin any good economic development for any industry. So that's accessing the essentials. So making sure we've got reliable, affordable energy, but water infrastructure is coming up everywhere, that we've got to actually think about water in different kinds of ways. This isn't just about pricing, for example. Accessibility of these places, some of them quite remote. So managing transport and freight, digital connectivity, making sure we've got waste facilities that enable circular economy principles and a better use of resources, housing, services, health, education, child care, and workforce development support in the regions itself. So that's the first thing. Second, and this doesn't get talked about enough, is that we really need to be investing a lot more in the capacity of local leadership in regions to coordinate and plan and understand what's happening so that they can attract and use the investment and support that's coming their way, and particularly in local government. It is a shame that we're seeing the end of the Latrobe Valley Authority because they played a really important role in having a regional presence, and they've still got a lot of challenges to come. The third thing we need to invest in is small and medium-sized enterprises and supporting them to be part of that supply chain. We sort of talk about supply chain, but there's actually some very targeted support that needs to happen across the entire economic ecosystem, which will enable larger operations to be able to get what they need to operate. The next thing, First Nations groups directly to participate in shaping development from the get-go. And this is going to be increasingly important in regions where we're talking about critical minerals mining and also renewable energy development, and places where there's a high dependence currently on fossil fuel royalty revenues for traditional owner groups. We're getting groups coming to us saying there's an opportunity for us here in terms of thinking about climate finance, for example, but actually benefiting economically on their own terms rather than just a standard status quo, things that we've been doing in the past. The next thing that hasn't been mentioned enough today is that we actually need much stronger environmental regulation in place. We need to be seeing this as an opportunity to invest in regenerating environments that are already under stress before we see another round of development, as well as climate impacts into the future. And this is particularly important where we don't have the replacement to the EPBC Act at the moment, and big questions around that. That's not just coming from environmentalists, it's also coming from industry that's looking for the clear rules around like what they can and can't do into the future, where they're dealing with a lot of outdated regulation. So again, it's not about cutting green tape, it's making sure that we have the right regulation, the right land use planning in place to actually enable things to happen, but happen so everyone's better off on the other side of this transition. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and special thanks actually for being here, well, being part of this panel and doing the presentation while you're actually quite legitimately sick there. So thank you very much for that. We welcome to the lecture now Sarah Boddington, who's doing her PhD with us on topics very much relevant to this session. Sarah comes from a leadership career in international development, including with jobs at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Sarah.
Hi, thanks very much. It's great to be talking to you this afternoon. And I hope to fill in a little bit. Actually, the first two talks have kind of worked out as a really kind of well-rounded trifecta, hopefully, because I'm hoping to fill in a little bit more of the social side of the implications of the energy transition for regional communities. And as not clicking. Thanks. Noting, of course, that the energy transition has particular implications for two sorts of communities in particular, and I'll add an extra circle to this after Amanda's presentation, but particularly communities facing coal phase-outs or phase-downs at different rates, depending on whether or not that coal is metallurgical or thermal coal, and communities facing new renewable projects, and that, of course, includes solar, wind, and transmission lines. And to get a sense of what sorts of concerns communities facing at the pointy end of change have or can have about these sorts of transitions, there was a really interesting study that was done in the US quite recently, surveying people in regional communities about their opposition to large-scale solar. And this survey found that 3 factors predicted opposition to large-scale solar. Those are place attachment, procedural injustice, and distributive injustice. And we can think of place attachment as a desire to protect the community and what different parts of the community find valuable about that community. We can think of procedural injustice as really wanting a fair process, as feeling like they've had a say, but also that the process by which these transitions have happened have had some integrity. And distributive injustice really refers to that distribution of benefits and burdens, so that the community that's bearing the change feels like the burdens are being fairly shared, and that they're also getting the benefits of the change as well, and a fair share of those. And we see these 3 same themes showing up in studies of communities in Australia facing the energy transition. So for this, I'll draw on 3 studies done, 2 in mining communities and 1 in a community facing a wind power proposal, and also some excellent work that came out of Hay Local Council as part of a community consultation into the renewable energy transition in Hay. So the studies in coal mining areas, 1 is in Blackwater, which is a metallurgical coal mining region in the Bowen Basin in Queensland. Also 1 done in Gladstone, Queensland, where of course Rio Tinto is a major employer, but it was also declared a renewable energy zone. Hay, of course, was declared a RES in 2022. And the study from King Island in Tasmania about the community's experience of a wind power proposal that was ultimately unsuccessful. And so we see these themes playing out across these different sources. Firstly, that desire to protect what's valuable in the community. So in the Blackwater study, really this sense, they're not facing, because it's metallurgical coal, they're not facing an imminent phase down of coal, but they are facing pressures as a regional community at the moment, both with the increase of fly in, fly out workers, and also declining services. And so a sense of a community that's already under stress from some of these dynamics. And with the future of export markets being uncertain, a sense that, this is a valuable place to live beyond just the jobs that it provides. What is the vision for this community in the future, and how can we protect and safeguard what we find valuable about this community? In the study from King Island, which was about a community's experience of a wind power proposal, and it points to the danger that if these consultation processes aren't really carefully managed, that they actually have the potential to cause great damage to the community. And in fact, that is what this wind power proposal and the process that was used in King Island did. And this study found that it caused damage both to interpersonal relationships within that community and also to local institutions. Going to the next theme, wanting a fair process. Again, from the community in Blackwater, and this perhaps speaks to some of Amanda's point about some of the areas that have gotten less attention. Because the phase down of coal isn't imminent, there's a sense that there isn't a process for them to engage in. And in that lack of a process, that the changes affecting the town are being driven by outsiders who don't necessarily know what's kind of valued and important and needs to be protected in that community. In the Hay consultation document from the Hay Council, this very strong sense as they face these changes associated with becoming a renewable energy zone, that they really want this change to happen with the community, not to the community, so that they really want to be part of the process going forward. And on the third theme, this sense of distribution of benefits and burdens, which we've heard already in the first two speakers. In Gladstone, already bearing the brunt of some big industry, certainly a sentiment coming through in that piece of research, that those benefits and burdens aren't currently fairly distributed, and that these are communities that do bear some of the negative costs, potential negative costs, unless they're alleviated, of having big industries in town. That can include environmental destruction, pointing to Amanda's point about the need for environmental regulation to protect the environment in these communities. But also a sense that, these are communities that are doing something really valuable for Australia in terms of producing energy, and are they getting a fair share of the benefits of that as well with declining regional services? And again, from Hay, looking down the gun of having a big industry moving into town, and kind of seeing that there is a potential for this boom-bust cycle, which can affect housing prices, salaries, inflationary pressures within that community, and really wanting to avoid the worst consequences of that potential for a boom-bust cycle. The other thing I wanted to mention is that these three concerns are kind of being felt against a backdrop of what has been, up until now in Australia, and perhaps still is in some respects, a fairly divisive debate over climate. And this is very much a debate that has positioned the energy transition as being driven by outsiders and not being in the interests of regional communities. And against this backdrop of divisiveness, some of my own research, talking to unconventional climate advocates working within communities, including communities in regional areas, point to the importance of trusted, legitimate, local leadership to kind of build faith and to chart a way forward. And, it needs to be local because of this insider-outsider dynamic that's been created by these sorts of narratives. So these advocates that I've been researching together with colleagues have very much place their success on themselves being able to frame themselves as part of the community and on the same side as the community. And as one of the participants in our study said, it's just the fact that the messenger is the message, right? So this leaves us with 4 points, I guess, about what is needed. One is that it's important to really protect what's valued in communities, and that is a diverse set of things because communities are diverse, that processes are seen as fair and legitimate, that they're led by insiders who are trusted, and that there is attention paid to alleviating burdens associated with big industries and a bigger share of the benefits. And I hope that some of those snippets from those studies that I've shared with you show that the benefits are much more than just kind of bringing in jobs. So that's a very important part of the benefits, but it's also about the quality of the services in the town, and, you know, really protecting the whole community. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And in her PhD, Sarah is working, among others, with Beck Colvin, who's a bit of a legend in this area, and will aim to bring Beck Colvin into the discussion later on as well. Now welcoming to the lectern Margie Johnson. She's the CEO of the Aluminium Council of Australia, and also the chair of the Australian Industry Greenhouse Network. And she comes from a long history of leadership positions in the Australian industry and energy industry. Margie.
You'll need to put that down to account for my height. And I don't need a clicker because I've only got one slide. So that'll save me some technical issues. So I'm probably a bit of a segue speaker. First of all, I'm going to throw right back to Matt Keane when he opened first thing this afternoon. And he talked about the construction of Snowy Hydro as a post-war effort in Australia. One of the other big post-war efforts we had here in Australia was we realised that we needed to have aluminium to be able to supply our own post-war needs. And so the construction of Bell Bay Aluminium was a post-war World War II initiative nearly 70 years ago, exactly the same time period as Snowy Hydro. And so we've had aluminium industry here in Australia for nearly 70 years. And as you look at the map, what you'll see is that there's also a very large overlap with Travis's map earlier on. In fact, I think we could just about share maps, Travis. And you'll also see, with looking at this, is for my industry, which includes bauxite exploration, 6 bauxite mines, 5 alumina refineries, 4 aluminium smelters, 20 extrusion presses, and we produce metal powders and aluminium coatings. Almost all our employees live and work in the regions in which we operate. And we also have very strong lines of intergenerational employment. Working for our industry for 40 years at the same plant is quite common, even the plants that are in Western Sydney or on the outskirts of Brisbane. And in regions like Cape York, the bauxite mines often have Indigenous participation rates above 30%. So aluminium, as I'm sure everybody now knows, is one of the commodities which is going to be most widely used in the global transition to a clean energy future. And it's expected that by 2050, global demand for aluminium will nearly double. So our historic advantage in the aluminium industry stem principally from the fact that we do have substantial high quality bauxite reserves. And bauxite, for anyone who doesn't know, should really have been called aluminium ore, but that's another whole story for another day. So let's pretend everybody knows what bauxite is. We historically had advantages in our energy, and we had access to a skilled workforce with expertise in mining and mineral processing. And while Australia's still got its bauxite reserves, we've lost our energy advantage, and there is, as we've discussed today, increasing pressure on our skilled workforce. So what do we need to ensure Australia is again able to capitalise on its natural resources and make green metals? Firstly, the answer to any question, if you work in alumina or aluminium or most other parts of industry, is energy. Firmed, reliable, low emission, internationally competitive energy is our single biggest opportunity and also our single biggest challenge. And while the cost of variable renewables has come down, the delivered cost of energy has not. So Australia's alumina and aluminium industries are located, as we discussed in Travis's speech, in key regional hubs. And these green metal industries are actually already creating some of the baseload flagship offtake agreements that can encourage, in these key locations, that it can encourage additional investment and renewable energy to support other new industries to be developed. For example, in Gladstone, we've recently signed more than 2 gigawatts of PPAs. And to give you context, Brad said that some of their modelling suggested that the grid needed to more than double. We currently use 2.6 gigawatts of electricity. If we want to run that on firm on unfirm, so variable renewables, we're going to need to multiply that by 3 to 4. Plus, to convert our alumina refineries, we need another 3 to 5 gigawatts. So we're going to need somewhere in the order of 15 to 25 gigawatts across Australia, but counting for the fact that the electricity will not always be on. So our number's more like multiplied by 10, not double. And that is the size of the opportunity and the challenge. We've also talked about the challenges that there are with transmission. And for those of you who lie awake at night worrying about the national electricity market, it's not a national electricity market. It's only covering the East Coast. I lie awake at night worrying about the Southwest Interconnected System, the SWIS, over in WA. For example, to electrify our alumina refineries, we don't have enough electricity today to electrify one alumina refinery, let alone the 3 that are there. So that's one of our biggest challenges. And we know that if transmission infrastructure is delivered in the manner and pace at which it's been historically delivered, it's going to be one of the rate limiting steps in the transition for our industry and many others. Secondly, once we've solved the energy problem, the next thing we need to do is Australia needs to be able to compete to attract capital to be able to invest in global decarbonisation at scale. Capital follows the strongest investment signals, and Australia's energy and industry policy signals are currently too weak to attract the globally relevant industrial abatement investment capital we need. There needs to be targeted public investment in green metals to reduce our long-term carbon exposure. We need to de-risk investment decisions in Australia. We need to accelerate the rate at which technology can be implemented through deployment and learning. So this is going to need to be a combination of production credits and transformational capital funding. And finally, Australia's integrated industry means that we need an efficient overall regulatory framework. Aluminium is one of only 2 materials we have in Australia which we actually make from mine to market, aluminium, steel being the other. So vertical integration has been our unique advantage in Australia, but that also means we need predictable, streamlined approvals for that whole value chain from mine to market. In considering that overall value chain, we want to maintain Australia's highest possible ESG standards, but we also need to remember in competing for that global demand, our global demand will continue to be met from elsewhere if it's not provided by Australia. Our bauxite capacity is increasingly vulnerable in Australia to both domestic policy and geostrategic risk, and this opportunity and risk should be reflected in critical mineral status. So with the right policy settings, bauxite, alumina and aluminium will have a central role in Australia's transformation to a clean energy superpower, with policy support to be commercially and environmentally sustainable and to ensure these vital industries may continue to support the communities, workers as they have done for more than 70 years.
Well, thank you very much, Margie. Some very clear statements there about some of Australia's very large metals industries, of course. And you know what? I feel very fortunate. I actually sleep through the nights. All right. Last not least, Associate Professor Joe Coventry, who's one of our research leaders on issues of decarbonizing industry, including green iron. He's got experience, long-standing experience in concentrated solar power and many other aspects, as well as prior experience as an engineer in business and industry before academia. Joe.
Up again. Thank you, Frank. So today I'm going to introduce a research program that we're involved in. Many of us are involved in here at the ANU and talk about ANU's role in it. It's called the HILT CRC. It's a 10-year program that started back in 2021. And it has the mission to de-risk the decarbonisation of heavy industry. And it focuses on 3 main industries. It focuses on green iron and steel, as it says down the bottom there, also alumina and cement and lime. So so these industries are, of course, some of our biggest greenhouse gas emitting industries in Australia. And they're also the industries that are the key industries of the partners in the HILT CRC, which are some of them you can see listed around the side there. There's also very much a regional focus. So you'll see I also have a map. I think everyone's had a map in this session, almost. So you can see that we've got particular hubs that we're focusing on, which are obviously located where some of these industries are and co-located often where the resources are. So, as I mentioned, ANU is a core member of the HILT CRC, and we're involved in just about half of all of the projects which have so far been run in this program. And we lead around about a quarter of these. The program is divided into 3 main areas, and I'm going to give you just 1 or 2 snippets from the first 2, which deal with essentially these processes, particularly I'll talk about green steel, green iron and steel, and how we actually change these processes, what we need to do to actually integrate and integrate renewables or decarbonise and transition to net zero in these different industries. The second program is about facilitating this change, and this is very much what Margie was just talking about, where we're going to get all this energy from. We need not just electricity, but we need heat, we need hydrogen, and sometimes we need to even think about whether or not we need to, have more variability in the way that we run these processes, actually turn them down a bit potentially at sometimes. And the third program is about facilitating this huge transformation. And we've heard actually quite a lot about this kind of thing today, but looking at what the markets are, if you're going to make green steel and it's going to cost a bit more, can you sell it? Where are you going to sell it? Or if you're going to export products to China, what is it? Is it steel or is it some intermediate product? And we've got Frank and Yorit and Emma as listed here leading some of the projects in that area. John Pye, who's in the audience here, Ali Reza Rabari, Bin Lu and myself leading some of the projects in the first 2 programs. So I'm just going to give you 1 or 2 snippets really in the next few slides about some of our work in this area. I guess one of the really nice pieces of work done here was together with Swinburne University is building up a sort of, I guess, from a ground up model of the whole green steel process and all the various different sort of ways that it can be done, right from mining the ore all the way through to delivering the delivering the steel at the end. And one of the really interesting findings from this work was that competitive green steel is possible, even without having the very highest grade ores. And actually, this is kind of debunking, something that's been talked about a lot in the media that, Australia doesn't have the high grade ores and therefore we're not going to be competitive in the future. You can see the graph on the right there compares 2 ores, and there's not a huge amount of difference actually in the cost of steel coming from the different ores. We also looked at the different processes that we could take and learned a few things about, I won't go into the details of those, but things like comparing different kinds of steel making processes, iron making processes using, for example, fluidized beds and shaft furnaces, etc. We found advantages for the fluidized bed pathway. I'll highlight on the left here, this is the sort of cost breakdown for a couple of those different pathways of steel. And what can we see from this? We can see that actually a very, very large proportion of the cost of the steel is actually the energy inputs that go into the steel. A lot of that goes into actually making the hydrogen. And what we see, if we assume a cost of hydrogen of $3.50 per kilogram, we can see that the cost of steel is about 50% more than the cost of steel from conventional pathways right now. So, that's where the sort of the market side becomes super important, like who's going to be paying that price and who are the early markets and how is it going to change? So, given that hydrogen is so important to steel, I'll just mention some work from another project that we've been working on. This is a project where we've looked at green hydrogen supply to industry and built sort of a model that not only optimizes sort of the size of the different assets that you need to make hydrogen, the wind, the solar, the electrolyzers and that type of thing, but also looks sort of spatially at where they might be relative to each other and it's different in different regions. And actually, we have the ability to sort of, set different limits to this kind of modelling. It might be due to constraints around environmental reasons, or to, the presence of national parks or whatever else in the region, or sensitive regions. So that's something where I think it crosses over a bit with some of the work from the other speakers. We're starting to try and look at how these systems could be developed in the future, also looking at regional factors. Speaking of regional factors, the cost breakdown that we've sort of come to in this work so far on the left shows that there's very different cost of hydrogens predicted in different regions. And primarily that's to do with cost of labour, for example. You can see that in some of the remote places, the costs are a lot higher. We do see, when we think back to that $3.50 I mentioned in the previous slide, we can see that costs right now are well above that, but we also do see a trajectory for that coming down over time. Another very interesting finding from this work was that hydrogen delivery, sort of 24/7 continuous hydrogen supply, looks to be quite feasible due to the very low cost of hydrogen storage. Most of the cost in the hydrogen is actually to do with the renewable energy supply and the electrolyzers rather than the storage. And just finally, I'll just quickly touch on, because we just heard, thank you, Margie, you mentioned the huge energy needs for aluminium and alumina. Well, in alumina, most of that need is in heat, either sort of as steam in the digestion process, or as high temperature heat in the calcination process. And we've done a lot of work looking at green heat supply in the CRC. And one of the key messages from that work is that when you look at the different storage options and the need to supply heat on almost a continuous basis, we find that if it's heat that you need, then thermal energy storage is looking like a really attractive option. And certainly our partners, the alumina partners that we work with in the CRC, are very, very interested in moving forward with pilots and things like that in this area. So I'll stop there, Frank, and I think in the interest of time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Joe, as well. The panelists are taking their seats. Amanda, you will be towering above us on the stage here. And we've got a quarter hour for discussion. We'll kick that discussion off perhaps just on the industry development points that we've been mentioning. And Margie, you called for, what did you say, significant government investments in green metals. You mentioned tax credits. Could you also imagine shared equity?
I'm not sure exactly what shared equity depends on. The devil will always be in the detail, but certainly the sort of costs that we're talking about to transform our industry, and for anybody who's read this week's Treasury paper on Front Door, it's ballpark the same sort of numbers they're talking. The cost to transform our industry based on the Mission Possible Partnership work is about $30 billion. That's consistent. That's within Australia, it's about $1 trillion globally. So that's a lot of money. So if we look at what our peers are doing, so in other countries, what we're talking about is a kind of a 50-50 co-investment between government and industry on that sort of transformational abatement, cost of capital, capital investment credit type scheme. So whether that's an equity model, I'm not quite sure. We'll have to see what the government proposes under Future Made in Australia Green Metals proposals.
Travis, would you perhaps want to expand on the investment facilitation role that the authority envisages to fulfill? Will that be relevant, what we're talking about here, in terms of kickstarting green metals?
Yeah, I think it is relevant. So I think the government's looking to work in two ways. One is through broad-based measures, so looking at things like production tax credits and so forth. Another way is by engaging in particular transformational project opportunities and working through with the proponents and others of those projects what's required to make those things happen, to catalyse those things. So it might be that a particular project equity is the best option. It might be a production tax credit. It might be some grant funding, or it might be a loan. It might be a combination of those things. That's part of what the Net Zero Economy Authority can bring to those particular projects. So again, the system, if you like, at a federal level is largely set up through broad-based measures. Part of the role we do through our investment facilitation function is by identifying and working with the proponents of those large transformational projects to work out how can we make those broad-based measures work for those projects, what combination of measures, how do we unlock them, but also, is there potentially some bespoke support that's required, and is it justified, is it in the public interest, and so forth. So that's our nascent investment facilitation function.
And Joel, casting our minds back to green iron, what are you hearing from the iron ore and iron processing industry in terms of views on this?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that the HILT CRC is trying to foster is sort of joint facilities to de-risk some of these new processes. So I mentioned the fluidized bed process. It's coming out as a low-cost process from all the modelling that we're doing, but there's definitely a need to do more work and piloting to de-risk, and that's really one thing that the HILT is trying to foster and bring together the companies, but then take that message to government for co-investment.
And Amanda, Sarah, you've put the emphasis on aspects such as procedural justice, procedural fairness, benefit sharing with communities as really important underpinnings of community acceptance. Now, there is perhaps a potential contradiction there between doing these processes properly and in depth and bringing everyone along, and the urgency that we perceive, in particular, of course, in getting a transition happening on the grid. Would you care to comment on those aspects? I think Sarah may be going first.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. Look, I think the same tension came up in the study I did with colleagues looking at unconventional climate advocates, that there is this tension between needing to move quickly and taking the time that community needs to kind of feel like they are shaping their own future. I think we need to learn from past transitions, and even the recent past in Australia. We all know what we've come out of in terms of climate policy. We've come out of a period where climate policy was kind of introduced and rolled back and introduced and rolled back. And while I certainly hope that we're beyond these times, I think moving ahead in a way that is divisive risks kind of taking us back to times where some of these gains can be lost if we don't actually kind of invest in bringing people with us. The other thing that I would say is that it's not that every person has to be consulted, but it is that the process needs to be seen locally as a fair process that reflects people's kind of concerns and aspirations. And so what that will look like and who the stakeholders involved are will differ from place to place. There are already quite a few organisations, Amanda's included, already working in communities to kind of build this consensus. I think Hay Council is another example. The unconventional climate advocates that I looked at in my study are another example. What we need is a range of stakeholders that have local legitimacy and sector expertise. So, for it to be seen as being kind of driven by people who know what is valuable in the community, but also, when it comes to things like agricultural land, that some of those kind of peak agricultural bodies are also involved, and that their sector expertise is reflected in the process. Yeah, so I might leave it there and hand over to Amanda.
Yeah, so I guess there's 2 points that come up with the question based on what Sarah was saying. I think we keep talking about social license and acceptance like, oh, we just have to keep everyone happy. I don't see it like that at all. This is about investing in people who are going to make or break this, whether they can actually manage the change and feed into industry policy, government decisions that investors are making as to whether we're going to have what we need for this to go ahead, and to go ahead well, ideally. So just to give you one example, there's a lot of things falling through the cracks at the moment because we're not investing in having that conversation on the ground. In Gladstone, there was the state government approved, classic example I go back to was an approval on state development land for a, won't say what sort of development, a very large processing facility that relied on wastewater treatment. Now, nobody spoke to the council, even though, because it was state development land, so it wasn't in council jurisdiction, but it's in the area. The decision was made based on the assumption they could use local council water treatment facilities, but that treatment facility is old, it's oversubscribed, and so the council did their own work and came up with a figure of something like $1 billion to actually have the water treatment facilities needed for all of the existing approved projects in the area. So that's it's actually a very practical thing. It's not just keeping people happy. The second thing is actually where you see that investment has been made in building that capacity of local leaders to understand what's happening. So places like Gladstone, things are moving faster. In 2021, when we had the Central Queensland Energy Futures Summit, first time people were brought together to understand this. Off the back of that, they got a flood. Trade Investment Queensland got international investors contacting them saying, we've heard about this. This is a place that wants to move forward. How do we get involved in that? Same thing happened when we launched the roadmap. And the local leaders have had influence at a national level over things like the design of the Net Zero Economy Authority, and internationally are asked to present all the time what they're doing. So I think sometimes going what seems to be slower and a little bit of investment up front actually can help things to move much faster.
We'll bring in Beck Colvin at this point. You got a mic up there? Okay, sorry, I thought you already had it. Dr. Beck Colvin from ANU.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks everyone for such a rich discussion. If I can, I'll share a reflection and then I'll put a question first to Sarah, but for everybody. And one of the reflections is actually brought on by Sarah's presentation and comments from Amanda, particularly, which is about the challenge of the extent of changes being felt that it's for the people and the communities that are experiencing it first. And the renewable energy zones are a good example because, as Matt Keane said, they're not really climate-based to begin with. It's about securing our electricity supply with the closure of the coal-fired power stations. So the early renewable energy zones are very much about taking electricity from the regions and into the cities. Once that's dealt with, then we have the regional-based industry hubs, which is a different story for those local communities. And drawing that distinction and recognizing the sequencing can be particularly important given some of those urban regional tensions that Sarah was talking to and that I know Amanda's very well versed in. And then thanks for indulging me on that. And then the question that I'll put first to Sarah, but I'd like to hear everyone's views on, is the integrated system plan has fairly large expectations about coordinated consumer energy resources. And this really involves coordinating a whole bunch of households potentially. I know Sarah's done some work looking at how householders make decisions around electrification and other things that are important for transition, but how they fit into daily life. So I'd be really interested in views on the coordinated consumer energy resources. Thank you.
And we'll do all of that real briefly.
Okay. Thanks, Beck. Yeah, so look, the study that Beck mentioned was a study looking at electrification, household electrification in the ACT. So this is, the ACT is already using a suite of policies that might be involved in other jurisdictions in terms of orchestrating householders to adopt and to electrify more quickly. So it's an interesting jurisdiction to see how people are experiencing these policies and programs. And so I talked to a wide range of householders in the ACT, really going out and talking to people, not really with a climate frame on, but just sort of saying to people, how do you make decisions about these sorts of things? And it was really interesting the degree to which climate is not at the forefront of people's minds when they're making these decisions. And this is in a very pro-climate jurisdiction where the government's put a lot of effort into climate communications and climate motivations for electrification. So people aren't thinking electrification climate. What they are thinking about are the everyday kind of logics around when people make decisions about renovation. Do I need more room for the kids? Am I thinking about retirement? Am I needing to make changes to my home? There are two maybe exceptions to that, and that's relevant to kind of making electrification quicker, and that is people do think about electrification as part of putting solar panels on. So solar is a bit of a gateway to electrification changes. And there are a small component of people who see electrification as a moral duty connected to climate change, but that's only a small kind of number of people. So I think it points to Beck's question, to the need to kind of take a socially embedded approach to how people are thinking about these decisions and what the everyday concerns for them are, and kind of connecting it perhaps back to our broader topic. You know, people are, and hopefully what the snippets from my short presentation showed, people are living lives in these communities and these big changes are kind of coming down the barrel at them. They need to be presented to them in ways that make sense in the context of their lives, and where they can have trust and faith that what is valuable in their community is going to be looked after as they move through these transitions. That's kind of the Australia we want to live in. So, you know, I think we do need to invest in those processes.
Amanda, we saw you vigorously nodding. We'll draw you in on the next question, and the next question is about First Nations communities. It's one of the elements I cut out of my short talk at the front, and that is really the, I think, shared sense that there's an overriding importance in doing a better job at benefit sharing with Indigenous communities, and not just engagement with, but benefit sharing with, and I guess we can put the contention that the establishment of new industries provides a renewed opportunity to get this better, to get this right and do it better. And there's of course some interesting models that are out there in terms of proposed green hydrogen developments, in terms of benefit sharing and so forth. Very interested, I think all of us would be in hearing perspectives by industry, by government, Travis, and researchers on how to go about First Nations elements and interests. Who will go first? I think we're looking at you, Travis, at this point.
Spotlight on. So we're at a very early stage, full stop, and particularly on First Nations issues. So we're probably in a situation where we're keen to learn rather than to share lessons. The way we're approaching it at the moment in this early stage is in the context of these large transformational projects that we're working on, and you know, Upper Spencer Gulf is an example. South Australian government has a great proposition for how they see that region transforming around hydrogen and green metals and critical minerals and so forth. Part of our work is looking at those investment propositions and what's required to get them off the ground, but we're also talking with the South Australian government and others about how can we make sure through that transition that the First Nations people of that region get some benefits from it, whether it's in employment, other forms of benefit sharing and so forth. So at this stage, the way we're tackling it is more just sort of in the context of particular projects, but that's also kind of recognizing that we're very early on our journey and you've got to start somewhere. And that's, if you like, the first step in our 1,000-mile journey, if you like.
Amanda, anything from your side of the table?
Yeah, it's been, we've been having a lot of conversations with different groups in different places. I think there's some interesting experiments that are agreements that are happening around equity of facilities, like you said, around hydrogen. The details of that I need to get a bit across. I guess some of these things have been tried before in mining, and we would need to make sure that people are genuinely benefiting and not just getting access to something after a certain period of time and then wearing the costs of something that's outdated later on. But there's also some interesting things that traditional owner groups are doing, like putting, if they need to participate or be consulted, putting some of the costs of that back on industry to say, you need us to be involved in this. You need to pay for us to be able to get the legal or other expertise that we need to be able to actually engage with this appropriately, so we can actually shape that development, and the economic development is genuine and on their own terms and not just tokenistic. I guess the big opportunity here though is how do we the rub that comes up in really honest discussions is around land rights, and a fear, particularly around critical minerals or new developments, or even renewable energy, is just going to be another way of dispossessing people. So what does the opposite of that actually look like when you're dealing with some groups that don't have a lot of capacity in some cases and others do? So that needs resourcing and thinking through. But there are traditional owners very keen to have this conversation.
I just note that I think we really do need to think about it. There's systemic things that we can learn, but also, as you said, Travis said, it really is. I mean, if I look at the range of opportunities for engagement, they really are hugely different for my members, depending on my mind's up on Cape York, some of the potential growth opportunities we have near Columbaroo. That's going to be very different to a site in Western Sydney. We can't just sort of lump it all in together. So we really need to think about what works and what works for that community. And that's really where we've had the best engagement, is by engaging and trying to create intergenerational employment and educational change in the same way that we want the best outcomes for all stakeholders involved in our projects.
We're actually at time. And so I'd like to give a really quick opportunity for maybe one burning question. And any very quick final remarks from the panel. We don't want to hold people much over time. Now I've got two ANU colleagues with questions, so we do preference the broader community in terms of the engagement here, and so.
Just the two.
You're putting me in a difficult position, aren't you? Okay. Look, why don't we leave the further conversation to a mix and mingle right after this? And I'll just throw to the panel once again for anything else that should be said.
My last comment in response to demand response that we were discussing earlier is, historically, aluminium smelters would have thought of themselves as constant load, and we now provide really different range of services into the grid. We help support minimum demand. So we are 10% of national electricity market on an everyday basis. When minimum demand drops, we're up to around 25% of the national electricity market. We have the ability to smelter like Tomago to drop 300, 600, 900 megawatts in less than a minute. We prefer 15 minutes if you can get it noticed, but we can do it in less than a minute safely. And we also offer frequency control ancillary services. And when we're not doing all that, we're making money and jobs for Australia. So think about your industry differently. Just because we've said previously, look, this is difficult, this is not how we're designed, but we are really trying to innovate in terms of how we operate our existing kit, because we know that we have a key role to play in our future market.
Frank, I'm not sure I have any final comments other than to say thanks again for allowing us to participate. It's been fantastic.
Thanks. I'll keep it short and sweet. And that is that the energy transition has big stakes for all Australians, but hopefully today has given you a sense of how those stakes are quite different for regional communities. And we've given you a sense of what some of those differences are. And so I do encourage you to seek out information sources to try and better understand the perspectives of regional communities in different positions. Thank you.
I just want to thank Frank and the team for putting this together. So thank you.
Amanda.
There's lots of smart, passionate people out there doing this. We're deep in the implementation, and we're going to have to do things differently. So let's find a way to do it better. So we're better on the other side of this when we look back at it in 2050. Thanks, everyone.
Very fitting words. Very fitting words to conclude our energy update on behalf of the university and ISETS. Thank you very much for spending your time with us. Please be in touch, and we're always open for your feedback and ideas. Thank you very much.